The champagne had just been poured when Rachel clinked her glass and said, "Let's all raise a toast to vintage fashion." Her eyes scanned the crowd and landed on me. Laughter scattered across the tables like broken glass. I stood there in my lilac silk dress, the same one I wore to my husband's funeral. "Bold choice," she added with a smirk. I smiled back. Because unlike her, I'd actually read the venue contract. "Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. I was never the loudest woman in the room. Not at PTA meetings, not at church, not at my own wedding." People called me graceful, sometimes reserved, and often old-fashioned. I never minded that. I believed in handwritten notes, in sitting with grief until it softened, in raising a son with both hands, one to hold him close and one to let him go when the time came. My name is Evelyn, and I was a mother before I was anything else. After my husband David died when Daniel was only 10, I learned how to carry a silence that echoed louder than most people's noise. I didn't remarry. I didn't complain. I went back to teaching high school literature, made my own repairs when I could, and folded my grief into habits. Soup on Sundays, lavender sachets in drawers, a kept promise that my son would never feel the absence of love, even if he felt the absence of a father. Daniel was my joy. A quiet boy, curious, kind. He never gave me trouble, not once. When he left for college, I cried for 3 days and then painted his room pale green so it would stop echoing his laughter. That's who I was. A woman who didn't ask for much, just presence, just respect, just a place at the table. When he first brought Rachel home, I'll admit, I was nervous. She was striking, the kind of woman who walks into a room and drinks up all the air, beautiful, polished, always on her phone. I could tell Daniel was enchanted. He looked at her the way David used to look at me back when we were young and hadn't yet lost anything. At first, I tried. I truly did. I offered to host Sunday dinners. I invited her for tea. I even gave her a small brooch that had belonged to my mother, a pearl and gold daisy that meant a lot to me. She accepted it without much comment, and I never saw it again. Still, I told myself, maybe she's just busy. Maybe I'm just being sensitive. But the small rejections piled up like snow, cold and quiet, until you realize you can't open your front door anymore. I began to feel more like a guest in Daniel's life than a mother. Texts would go unanswered. Plans would be made without me. Rachel always seemed polite on the surface, but it was the kind of politeness that made you feel like you'd overstayed your welcome just by existing. Things got worse after they got engaged. I remember offering to help with the wedding, financially, logistically, even just emotionally. Rachel smiled and said, "We've got it covered, but thank you," in the same tone you'd use on a telemarketer. I felt my cheeks flush, but I smiled back. I always smiled back. And then came the dress. I had searched for weeks. I didn't want anything loud or flashy. I wasn't trying to compete or make a statement. I just wanted something that felt like me, something with memory in the thread. I found it tucked away in a small boutique, lilac silk, long sleeves, gently fitted. The moment I touched it, I knew. Not because it was trendy, not because it was expensive, but because it was the same soft shade I'd worn to David's funeral when I promised myself I'd survive for Daniel's sake. The saleswoman told me it was elegant. I told myself I'd wear it with grace. I sent Rachel a photo out of courtesy. She replied, "It's very traditional. You might want to consider something a bit more modern. Don't want to clash with the decor, haha." I reread that text 3 times. I didn't reply. I kept the dress anyway. Not because I wanted to spite her, but because I'd already spent enough of my life trying to disappear so others could shine. I would not do it again, not even for my son's wedding, not for anyone. That lilac dress wasn't chosen out of vanity. It was chosen out of memory, of love, of quiet strength. I didn't know it then, but that silk would one day carry the weight of my dignity and the cost of her mockery. From the outside, Daniel and Rachel were the perfect couple. They had that curated sparkle you see in engagement photos, sunlight bouncing off her diamond ring, coordinated outfits, captions about forever. They met at a tech conference in San Diego. She worked in marketing. He was in software. It was fast. He proposed within 6 months. When he told me, I blinked twice and smiled. "If she makes you happy," I said. He nodded, though something in his eyes flickered. Not hesitation exactly, just a tiredness I hadn't seen before. From the start, it was clear who held the reins in the relationship. Rachel planned every inch of the wedding with the precision of a Fortune 500 launch. She had spreadsheets, mood boards, planners who took calls at midnight. Daniel mostly followed her lead, sometimes contributing an idea, only for it to be folded neatly back into her version of things. She didn't ask for my opinion. She delegated tapuais. First, I thought maybe that was just her way. I told myself, it's a new generation. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. So I stepped back. I offered to help with the flower arrangements. She hired a luxury florist. I asked if she wanted to include any family traditions in the ceremony. She said, "We're keeping it clean and modern. Minimalism is the vibe." Still, I tried to show up with grace. I went to the bridal shower even though I wasn't introduced to half the room. I brought a hand-knit throw blanket folded in ribbon as my gift. Rachel's college roommate laughed and whispered something behind a manicured hand. I smiled. That was always my reflex. To smile. Then came the email. A month before the wedding, Rachel sent out a message to the immediate family. It was titled Aesthetic and Wardrobe Guidelines. She asked guests to stick to neutrals: beige, pale blue, gray. Please avoid loud colors or overly vintage attire that may draw attention or photograph poorly, she wrote. We want the photos to be timeless. My lilac dress hung in the closet. I didn't reply. I didn't ask for permission. I also didn't forget. The signs weren't loud. They never are. That's the cruelty of these things. They come wrapped in politeness, coated in sugar. But when I look back, the pattern was clear. At the rehearsal dinner, I was seated 3 spots away from Daniel. Rachel's aunt was next to him, laughing like she had just discovered motherhood. When Daniel gave his little toast, he thanked both sets of parents. My mom raised me, he said, glancing at me. But Rachel taught me how to be a man. The words caught me off guard. Taught him. I had spent 2 decades showing him what strength looked like. Had he forgotten those nights I sat by his bed with a cool cloth when he had fevers? The jobs I worked? The holidays I made feel whole when everything else had been ripped away? But I said nothing. I clapped along with the rest of them. I always did. In the week leading up to the wedding, small slights came like drips from a leaky faucet. The family photos were scheduled without me. I was told I could pop in at the end for a few shots. The cake had a flavor Rachel's family preferred, though Daniel was allergic to strawberries. When I asked about it, she said, "It's just a small reaction, right?" One night, after a particularly strained phone call, I sat at my kitchen table, fingers tracing the edge of my teacup, and whispered to the empty room, "I don't know who I am in this story anymore." The truth is, I didn't hate Rachel. I pitied her. There was something hollow in the way she clung to perfection, like a child gripping glass. But pity doesn't soften the sting of being erased, not when it comes from someone your son chose as his partner for life. Then something shifted. I had asked the wedding coordinator politely to send me a copy of the venue's contract. I told her I had dietary restrictions and wanted to check what was included. That was true, but I also wanted to read the terms. I wanted to know what I was walking into. In the very back of the document, printed in pale gray, was a clause, a unique stipulation offered by the high-end venue. In the event of documented personal harassment, degradation, or exclusionary behavior by any party during the contracted event, the venue retains the right to shut down the event early without refund upon request by the injured guest. It was buried, a legal safety net probably meant for serious incidents. But I read that line 4 times. I didn't know then if I'd ever use it, but I highlighted it anyway. As I folded that contract back into its envelope, something in me settled. I might not have a microphone or a stage, but I now held something just as powerful. Quiet leverage. The day of the wedding arrived like a pageant for someone else's story. The sky was clear. The gardens at the estate venue were trimmed to perfection. Staff moved like clockwork. It was beautiful, in the way a magazine spread is beautiful, distant, curated, cold. I arrived early, as instructed, and was quietly directed toward a poignée, private room labeled Mother of the Groom. I stepped inside. No flowers, no card, no welcome. The bridesmaids passed the door without looking in. I sat alone for 33 minutes. Eventually, a young girl with a headset knocked softly and handed me a schedule. "You'll be joining the family photos at 2:40 for about 5 minutes, she said, not unkindly. Then added, "You won't be needed after that. Not wanted, not invited, just not needed." I nodded. I'd come prepared. I took out the dress, lilac silk, with delicate embroidery that caught the light like memory. I slipped it on slowly, like armor. On the inside hem, stitched in small ivory thread, were 3 initials, DES, David's, mine, and Daniel's. A seamstress had done it quietly for me, years ago. As I stepped into the courtyard for the family photos, I saw them all clustered beneath the arbor, the bridesmaids in ice blue chiffon, the groomsmen in tailored charcoal suits, Rachel radiant in white, Daniel standing beside her, mouth tight. Someone noticed me, then another, then Rachel. She turned, looked at my dress and tilted her head. Her smile was dry, calculating. "Oh, you wore that color," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Brave choice." Her mother laughed softly. The photographer raised his camera. I said nothing. I stepped into place. I held my son's arm for a single photo. Then I stepped out. The rest of the afternoon blurred into a series of sharp, tiny humiliations. My name was misprinted in the program, Evelyn Sanders, with an I, not a Y, and no mention of mother, of the groom. I was placed at table 14, near the kitchen doors, next to the florist and the DJ's assistant. The napkin at my setting was folded incorrectly. Everyone else's had tiny ribbons. Mine didn't. During cocktail hour, I tried to make conversation. People nodded politely, eyes already drifting toward the bar or the dance floor. Rachel's cousin asked if I was with the staff. I smiled. I always smiled. Then came the dinner. The band started playing. The bridal party entered. Speeches began. Rachel's father went first, a long-winded toast about legacy, beauty, and raising strong daughters. He said, "We're so proud of Rachel for being bold, brilliant, and choosing a partner who reflects the very best in her. And thank you to both sets of parents, even those who remained quietly in the background." People laughed. Rachel's mother went next. She spoke of the power of women who know what they want. Then a light jab. Some women spend decades lost in old books and poetry, but my daughter built her life in the real world. I felt the eyes shift toward me. I cut into my salmon. It was undercooked. When the glasses were filled for a final toast, Rachel stood and tapped her fork against the crystal flute. "Before we move to dancing," she said, "I want to take a moment to celebrate the many styles in this room today. Pause, smile. Some of us are trendsetters, and some are timeless in their own way. Let's raise a glass to vintage elegance, The way she said vintage made it taste like dust. People chuckled. My son's eyes dropped to the table. Raised my glass with everyone else. Sipped once. Then excused myself. I walked through the reception hall slowly, past white roses and tall candles, out toward the corridor that led to the office. The venue manager stood behind a polished oak, desk, clipboard in hand. Her name was Lena. I unfolded the envelope I'd kept in my clutch. "There's a clause," I said softly. "Page 17, harassment or exclusion, public mockery. The event can be ended by request." She blinked. "Are you certain you want to—" "I'm not making a scene," I said. "I'm making a decision." She nodded, walked away. I stood alone for a moment, the thrum of music still leaking through the wall. Then I went back to my table. I sat down, smiled at the DJ assistant, ate one bite of cake. The song changed, the lights shifted, vendors started to move quietly. The band stopped. Rachel looked around, confused. Her coordinator whispered in her ear. Her mouth opened. Then she looked at me. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with a napkin and folded it neatly on the plate. She humiliated me with a microphone. I responded with a signature. One smile, one clause, and the reception clock began to tick, in silence. As I sat at that back corner table, the laughter around me blurring into static, I found myself drifting backward, not by choice, but by gravity. Memory has a way of pulling you in when your heart's too sore to fight it. The last time I wore that lilac dress was nearly 2 decades ago. A colder day. No music, no candles, just the whisper of wind outside the church and the slow creak of wooden pews as mourners sat in silence. David's funeral. I hadn't wanted to wear black. It felt too final, too hollow. So I wore lilac, a color he once said made me look like the sky right before dusk. "Like a lullaby," he told me once. "That's what you are to me." I wore it again the day I signed our mortgage papers. Trembling, alone, afraid. I wore it to Daniel's elementary school recital when I had to sit alone in the 3rd row because the front seats were taken by other parents with complete families. And I wore it one last time on the night Daniel graduated high school, when I stood by the fence outside the football field, clapping until my hands stung. That dress had soaked up more tears than any handkerchief I owned. It had never been about fashion. It had been my armor, my thread-woven resilience, and now it had been turned into a punchline. I stared at the uneaten slice of wedding cake. Vanilla with strawberry filling, the very ingredient Daniel was mildly allergic to. Rachel knew that. She brushed it off during the tasting, said it was just a skin thing, and told him to take a Benadryl if needed. That moment had bothered me more than it should have. But now, sitting in that room, I saw it for what it was, a quiet declaration of whose comfort mattered more, not yours. That was the message in every decision, every slight, every invitation that never came. I was not the mother. I was a figure in the background, a muted silhouette that had served its purpose. Rachel didn't hate me. Hatred requires engagement. She erased me and expected applause for doing it kindly. I picked up my fork and took a bite of cake. I could barely taste it. My throat had tightened too much. Somewhere nearby, someone tapped a glass again. A signal for a speech, more voices, more praise, more theater. I glanced around the room. People were laughing, posing for photos, clinking flutes. But the staff had begun moving, silently, strategically. One by one, trays were removed, lights slightly dimmed, the transition subtle but irreversible. As the motion in the room shifted, my mind pulled up a more recent memory. 2 months before the wedding, I had sent Rachel a handwritten letter. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle request, a suggestion to maybe include one of David's photos on the memory table they were preparing. Just one. Even wallet-sized, she didn't respond. When I asked Daniel about it later, he rubbed the back of his neck. Rach just thinks it might bring the mood down, he said. She's trying to keep everything upbeat. I nodded. But that night, I sat in the dark with David's old photograph in my lap and said nothing. I had said nothing for too long. I'd let myself shrink to keep the peace, swallowed pride to keep the table full, smiled through slights so my son wouldn't feel torn. But now, here I was, watching my own erasure unfold in real time, wearing the one thing that had ever made me feel whole, and still being treated like a disruption. There, in the dimming glow of chandelier light, the dam cracked. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. I began typing. Just a few lines. A journal entry, really. She didn't stab me with words. She sliced me slowly with grins. And my son handed her the knife. When I finished, I saved it and looked up. Rachel was at the head table, reapplying. Her lipstick in a compact mirror. Daniel leaned over to say something. She laughed, loud, exaggerated, then waved her hand toward a staff member, clearly annoyed. The venue manager approached her quietly from behind. Rachel turned, confused. They spoke for a moment. Her face stiffened. That was it. The moment, everything shifted. She looked at me. I didn't blink. She stood up suddenly, knocking her chair back. Guests paused, turning toward the commotion. Daniel followed her into the hallway, bewildered. I watched her high heels vanish through the double doors. The DJ faded the music out. One by one, conversations halted. A hush fell over the room like snowfall. Have you ever been left out like that? By your own family? Would you have stayed quiet? Across the room, people began to murmur. A bridesmaid whispered, "Is something wrong?" The officiant looked lost. Rachel's mother stood up, glaring around, as if hunting for someone to blame. And still, I sat at table 14, hands folded, spine straight, not because I was calm, but because the storm had already happened inside me, and I had survived it. She thought she was silencing me with her toast, but my silence was never surrender. It was the sound of power building. And it had finally arrived. I never liked spectacle. Even as a teacher, I preferred quiet corrections to raised voices. There's a dignity in restraint. And that day, I clung to it like a rope in a flood. As Rachel stormed out and whispers rippled through the reception hall, I stood calmly from my chair. I adjusted the pearl clip in my hair, straightened the folds of my dress, and walked, not rushed, toward the side corridor where the venue's main office sat tucked behind a curtain of ivy. Lena, the venue manager, stood waiting. Her expression was firm but respectful. "We've begun enacting the clause," she said, holding a clipboard. "Are you absolutely certain you'd like to proceed?" I took a breath. Not out of hesitation, but ceremony. This was a moment worth acknowledging, even if only to myself. "Yes," I said. "She mocked me publicly. There are witnesses. The emotional exclusion has been consistent, documented." I handed over the small envelope containing a printed summary, screenshots, the program misprint, the wardrobe email. I'd prepared it 3 days ago, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, with tea growing cold beside me. Lena nodded. Then, as per Clause 17C, the event will be concluded within the hour. Vendors are being notified. Bar closes at 7:30. She offered me a seat. I declined. I'd like to return to the hall. When I stepped back into the reception, the air had changed. It was like the temperature had dropped, not by degrees but by atmosphere. People felt it, even if they didn't understand it yet. The music had slowed. The bartender was no longer pouring. The caterers were quietly packing up behind the scenes. I walked back to my seat at table 14, took a sip of water, smiled at the DJ's assistant. Across the room, Rachel re-entered, her face pale and tight. She was flanked by her mother and Daniel, who looked stunned. He scanned the room like he didn't recognize it. Rachel beelined toward the venue manager, voice already rising. "You're shutting it down?" she hissed. Based on her feelings? Lena, to her credit, stayed calm. Ma'am, you violated a clause your family agreed to in writing. Harassment, especially public, has consequences here. We've upheld our terms. No refund will be issued. But this is my wedding, Rachel snapped. You can't just— I'm afraid we can, and we are. The lighting crew had already begun disassembling the uplighting. The champagne tower was quietly taken down, glass by glass. The band's lead singer made an awkward excuse about a scheduling issue. Guests began to stir. A few clutched purses. Others whispered. Someone finally asked, "Is the wedding over?" Rachel turned her fury toward me. "This is you," she said, trembling. "You're doing this because of a dress? Because I didn't bow down to your matriarchal fantasy?" I stood slowly. I didn't raise my voice. "No, Rachel. I'm doing this because you mistook silence for weakness. You've been erasing me since the day you met me. This dress? It isn't a costume. It's a history book you never bothered to read." Daniel looked like he might cry. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I turned to him. "Because I didn't want you to have to choose. But in not choosing, you did." He stepped back. Swallowed hard. Rachel's mother was speaking now. Something about lawsuits and entitlement. I didn't even look at her. Instead, I walked to the head table and gently picked up my place card, the one that had never been there. Then I walked back to my table and sat down again. I didn't need applause. I didn't need pity. I needed air. Guests began to rise. Some filtered outside, unsure if they should stay. A few came to me quietly and said they were sorry. One older woman whispered, "You carried yourself with such grace. I would have screamed." I smiled. Sometimes silence is louder than a scream, and in that moment I felt it. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but relief, like walking out of a room that's been shrinking for too long. I finished my water, folded my napkin again, and stood. A breeze moved through the open reception doors. I followed it into the garden. It was evening now. The sun was dipping low behind the hedges. Candles flickered, and staff were beginning to clear the tables. Rachel remained near the entrance, frozen. The dream wedding crumbling like the fondant roses on her now abandoned cake. Daniel stood still, caught between two women, one who gave him life and one who had rewritten it. I didn't look back as I stepped through the garden path. I didn't need to. My heels clicked gently on the stone, not in triumph, in clarity. They tried to write me out of their fairy tale, but I held the pen and I knew when to end the chapter. I didn't have to stay to watch the chaos unfold. But I did, not out of pettiness, but out of completion. Some endings deserve to be witnessed. As I walked along the gravel path behind the venue, a line of SUVs began pulling up early. Guests were confused, murmuring into their phones, checking watches. One woman clutched her heels in her hand, weaving between garden chairs, as a staff member politely but firmly explained that the reception was ending prematurely due to contractual conditions. Inside, the DJ had stopped altogether. The lights came up, sharp and unflattering. The fairy tale glow was gone, and in its place was a sterile truth. This wasn't love unfolding. It was ego unraveling. Back near the bar, Rachel was pacing, phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her voice cracked as she hissed to someone over the line, probably a friend or maybe even her lawyer. She used the venue clause. What kind of psycho plans that in advance? The irony, of course, was that I hadn't planned it as an act of war. I'd prepared it as an act of survival. One small sliver of control in a sea of quiet indignities. Daniel hovered near her, trying to calm her down, but she wasn't listening. She never did when it came to anything that didn't orbit her vision. Eventually, Lena, the venue manager, approached Rachel's mother with a neutral expression. We'll need your payment settled in full before 8 Gao. There will be no partial refund, and you'll be responsible for the early closure fee. Rachel's Uai. Mother gasped like someone had just announced a death in the family. You're charging us for that woman's tantrum? Lena's eyes barely flicked in my direction. We're enforcing what was agreed to. The conditions were clear. That's when Rachel spun toward me again, mascara smudging just slightly under one eye. You just couldn't let me have this, could you? She snapped. You had to make it about you. You wanted to be the star. You wanted the power. I tilted my head. No, I said. I wanted to be respected. You had the power, and you used it to belittle me in front of a room full of strangers. All I did was respond, with the only voice you left me. For a second, the rage flickered in her. Then something colder settled behind her eyes. You'll never see Daniel again, she whispered. I felt that, the way a tree feels the axe before it falls, but I didn't flinch. That's his choice, I said. Not yours. Daniel looked like he'd swallowed glass. Rachel, please. No, she snapped. She just blew up our wedding. Daniel turned to me then. Not as a groom, not as a man, as my son. Why didn't you tell me it was this bad? I took a breath. Because every time I tried, I saw the way you looked at her, and I couldn't bear to be the one to dim that light. His shoulders slumped. I didn't know. I know, I said. That's what hurts the most. Guests began to leave in clusters. Some gave me polite nods, others just looked away. Rachel's bridesmaids disappeared entirely. One of them crying as she rushed past the garden gate. The cake remained untouched. The first dance never happened. The memory table, the one with no photo of David, had toppled slightly during cleanup. A candle had spilled. No one noticed. Rachel's dream wedding had ended, not with a bang, but with a steady, graceful dismantling. And I? I stayed until the last light flickered out. Daniel caught up with me as I reached my car in the gravel lot. His tie was loose and his voice was hoarse. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. She's complicated, but she's not all bad. No one is, I replied. But when someone shows you again and again that your mother doesn't matter to them, it becomes hard not to believe them. He looked at the ground. I'm sorry, I nodded. I know. He reached out, almost instinctively, and touched the sleeve of my dress. This is the same one you wore when Dad passed. Yes, I said quietly. Why? Because it reminds me of strength, of promises I made when I was younger, to protect you, to stand when it got hard, to never let anyone rewrite who I am. He swallowed hard. I didn't protect you. You weren't supposed to protect me, Daniel. You were supposed to see me. That's all I ever needed. The wind picked up. Somewhere behind us, a champagne flute shattered on stone. I turned to my car door. I'll be fine. Will I? He asked. I paused, hand resting on the handle. That depends, I said, on how long you keep standing next to someone who keeps shrinking you to fit her world. He said nothing, just watched me go, and for once, I didn't look back. Reception was over. But the reckoning, for both of them, had only just begun. The following morning, I woke to silence. Not the soft, comforting kind, the kind that hugs your shoulders and lets you exhale, but the kind that sits on your chest, heavy, hollow, thick with aftermath. I sat in the kitchen, tea cooling beside me, the lilac dress draped gently across the back of a chair like an old memory. I didn't hang it up just yet. I needed it nearby, like armor cooling after battle. My phone had buzzed 4 times during the night, all from Daniel. No voicemail, no text, just missed calls. That was a relief, in a way. It meant he hadn't written me off completely. But I didn't reach out. Not yet. I needed him to come forward because he wanted to, not because someone told him to. By late afternoon, he did. I heard the knock before I saw him. His face was puffy from lack of sleep, his shirt wrinkled, no ring on his finger. Just a shadow behind his eyes. I hadn't seen since he was 10, and came home crying because a kid told him he didn't have a real family. He stood at the door like a man not sure if he was still welcome. I didn't know where else to go, he said. I opened the door wide. This is your home. He sat at the table, right where his father used to sit. He didn't speak for a while, just stared at the floor, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was trying to wake himself. From a long, slow nightmare. She's furious, he finally said. I'm not surprised. She thinks I should have kicked you out of the wedding. That stung, but I didn't show it. And what do you think? He swallowed. I think I've been asleep for a long time. I nodded. I kept making excuses for her, he continued, because it was easier than confronting what was right in front of me. She's not cruel, Mom, but she's careless with people's feelings, with mine, with yours. There was pain in his voice, but it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the realization that he'd been bending for so long, he no longer knew his own shape. He looked up at me then. You did what I should have done months ago. I shook my head. No, you had your own lessons to learn. I had mine too. What was yours? That silence doesn't protect anyone. It only delays the damage. He reached across the table then, took my hand like he hadn't done since he was a boy. I'm so sorry, Mom. I squeezed his fingers gently. I know. We sat there, just breathing, for a long while. And then he said something I didn't expect. She told me she never wanted kids. I blinked. She told you that now? No. She told me before we got engaged. I thought she'd change her mind. He laughed dryly. She doesn't change her mind. That sentence carried more weight than either of us said out loud. He looked at the lilac dress, still resting over the chair. You wore it like armor. It was, I said. Will you ever wear it again? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe not to a wedding. We both chuckled softly, like two survivors laughing at the storm they'd just outrun. Then his face turned serious. I'm thinking of annulling it, he said. The marriage. I've been up all night. There's no foundation there, just performance. And I let it happen. I didn't react. I didn't want to sway him either way. That wasn't my place. It has to be your decision, I said. Not because of me, not because of last night, but because you finally looked in the mirror and saw the whole truth. He nodded slowly. I did. And I didn't like what I saw. He stayed for dinner. I made soup, simple, warm, familiar. He didn't eat much, but he stayed at the table, talking about childhood, about his father, about things we hadn't spoken of in years. It felt like healing in pieces. When he left that night, I walked him to the door. He turned before stepping outside. Did you ever regret raising me alone? Never, I said. Not even once. He paused. Do you think I can start over? Of course you can, I said. You just have to choose who you want to be, not who you were told to become. He nodded and walked into the night, slower but straighter. Lighter somehow. I watched him go until the headlights vanished around the corner. Inside, I folded the lilac dress carefully, not with sadness, but with gratitude. It had done its job. He walked away from me, not as a boy torn between two women, but as a man who finally knew which parts of himself were worth saving. 2 weeks passed. The roses from the wedding were long dead, the catering company had moved on to their next glossy event, and the photos, what few had been taken before. The lights dimmed, remained unposted. There were no honeymoon pictures, no Mr. and Mrs. mugs, just silence. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. I began to breathe differently. For the first time in months, I sipped my morning tea without flinching when a notification lit my screen. I repotted the violets on my windowsill. I read 2 novels in 4 days and started painting again. Not for skill, just for the feel of it. I let color come back into my life, not through others' approval, but through my own quiet permission. Daniel called every couple of days, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to sit in silence with me on the phone. He hadn't returned to the apartment. He was staying with an old college friend for the time being. One evening, he came by with a box of things. "I cleared out my stuff," he said simply. "I told her I need space, and I'm not sure I'll be back." He didn't cry, but there was a grief in him, not just over Rachel, over himself. The version of him he'd traded away in the name of partnership. She said I embarrassed her, he told me. Said I was weak for not taking control of the situation. I stirred sugar into his tea. "Control isn't love," I said. "It's choreography. And you were never a dancer, Daniel. You were a thinker, a feeler." He exhaled. "I miss being that." I reached across the table and touched his wrist. Then, start again, from there. He smiled for the first time in days, really smiled. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail, thick, expensive, embossed, from Rachel's mother. Inside was a typed letter that managed to say everything and nothing. It blamed confusion, emotional stress, and the natural tension between women during transitional milestones. It never once used the word apology. At the bottom, a P.S. "We hope this doesn't permanently damage the relationship between our families." I folded the letter once and placed it in the fireplace, not with rage, with release. Let them carry their own weight. I was done shouldering it. A few days later, Daniel came by with something tucked under his arm. A leather-bound wedding album. "We didn't get very far," he said, flipping it open. 6 pages, maybe 10. There, in the second spread, was the photo of me and Daniel under the arbor. He was smiling gently, holding my hand. I was looking slightly away from the camera, mid-laugh, unposed, honest. He tapped the page. "This is the only one I want to keep." I ran my fingers along the edge of the photo. "You look like him," I whispered. "Dad?" "Yes." The way he looked at me when he wasn't trying to prove anything. Daniel closed the book. I remember his voice less now. "You'll remember his steadiness longer," I said. "That's what stays." We sat in the living room, the old clock ticking behind us. And just like that, the silence between us, the one Rachel had built like a wall, began to dissolve. The next day, I drove to a gallery downtown, a community space, local artists. I'd passed it 100 times but never gone in. I signed, "Up for a watercolor class, 3 hours every Thursday. Beginners welcome." At the first session, the instructor asked everyone to paint something symbolic. I chose a pale garden in the early morning light, soft purples, dusty blues, and a figure walking through a path with her head high. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew what it was. It was me. I left the gallery that day with paint stained. Fingers and a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The truth is, the wedding didn't fall apart because of one toast, or one dress, or one woman's pride. It unraveled because disrespect is a slow rot, and no amount of candles or coordinated napkins can cover its smell forever. Rachel hasn't reached out. I don't expect she will. Some people can only see their reflection when the mirror breaks, and even then, they blame the glass. But Daniel visits every Sunday now. We take long walks. Sometimes we don't even talk about it. Sometimes we just sit under the elm tree in the yard, remembering who we used to be and choosing who we want to become. That is the real miracle. Not revenge, not victory, reclamation. Have you ever had to walk away quietly just to keep your dignity? "What would you have done in my shoes?" The wedding ended early, but the healing began right on time, the moment I chose myself, without apology. I've learned that dignity doesn't always come in dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes in the quiet click of a door closing behind you, in the weight of a dress you refuse to take off just because someone else can't understand its meaning, in the decision not to fight, but to withdraw your presence from where it's no longer respected. That wedding wasn't the beginning of a feud. It was the end of an illusion. For so long I had clung to the hope that if I just stayed agreeable, patient, small, I could keep peace. I could keep my son close. I could make room for a woman who had no intention of meeting me halfway. But what I didn't realize until that day was this. When you keep shrinking yourself to fit someone else's comfort, they never stop asking you to disappear entirely. So, I stopped shrinking. I stopped smiling through slights. I stopped dressing for invisibility. And I stopped making myself available for harm dressed up as family dynamics. I didn't destroy that wedding. I preserved myself inside of it. That's something I wish more women my age would hear. You don't have to earn your place through suffering. You don't have to be grateful for being tolerated. Love, real love, doesn't ask you to disappear. There was a time, not so long ago, when the idea of conflict terrified me. But now, I realize silence can be more powerful than confrontation when wielded with clarity and intention. And sometimes a signature on a contract can speak louder than a scream. My relationship with Daniel is not perfect, but it's real again. We talk, we laugh, we leave room for silence without tension. He's learning who he is outside of Rachel's orbit. I don't ask for updates, I don't press, I just listen. Because love isn't about controlling someone's choices. It's about being strong enough to let them choose, and still loving them even if you're not the one they pick every time. He asked me recently if I'd ever consider dating again. I told him no, not because I'm bitter, but because I'm not empty. My life is full now, not with noise, but with substance. I take my watercolor class. I volunteer at the library twice a week. I read novels in bed without guilt. I cook for one and still light a candle at dinner. And the lilac dress? It's hanging in my closet, pressed, clean, waiting, not for another wedding, not for a funeral, just for me, because it's mine. And for once, that's reason enough. To the women listening, the mothers, the daughters, the sisters who've ever been made to feel too much or not enough at the same time. You don't need to wait for someone else to hand you the microphone. You don't need a spotlight or a stage to reclaim your voice. Sometimes all you need is a moment of stillness and the decision to stop apologizing for being exactly who you are. The world won't always clap when you choose yourself, but you will sleep better at night, and you will rise stronger in the morning, because quiet strength isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing that sometimes the most radical act of self-respect is simply standing up and leaving the room, with your head held high and your story intact. And that is how I left that wedding, not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a woman who finally remembered she had nothing left to prove, just everything left to protect. They tried to write me out of the story, but I held the pen the whole time. And now, I'm writing something entirely new.